A very warm welcome to the British Academy this evening, to this panel discussion on big data, organised jointly by the British Academy and Sage Publications Limited, forming part of the 2012 ESRC Festival of Social Science. My name is Robin Jackson, Chief Executive of the British Academy, the National Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and I'm delighted to welcome you here. The Academy has a clear interest in tonight's topic. Last year we launched a 4-year programme to support quantitative skills, seeking to build capacity and to demonstrate the value of these skills for education and research, for competitiveness and for society. And last month we published a statement, Society Counts, outlining the importance of quantitative methods, the range of initiatives currently underway to meet the various challenges we face and the need for a national strategy. The Academy is delighted to be working with ESRC, the Royal Statistical Society, the Nuffield Foundation, Office for National Statistics and others, helping to ensure that students and researchers are equipped with the skills to use and interpret the vast and increasing amount of data available. So we're delighted to be hosting this evening's discussion. The UK has, over the last 6 decades or so, invested in a world-class social science data infrastructure that's unrivaled by almost any other country. These data provide invaluable insight into the patterns and trends that underpin many of our current social and research challenges. I'm looking forward to hearing about the opportunities and challenges that big data offer to the social sciences and to us more generally. So, very much welcome, and I'll now introduce Carolyn Porter from Sage Publications to say a few words.
Good evening. My name is Caroline Porter and I'm the publisher for social science and humanities journals at Sage. I'm really looking forward to this debate because the subject of big data presents significant opportunities and implications for researchers, policymakers and society more broadly. As a leading social science publisher and the world's largest research methods publisher, the debate around big data goes to the very heart of what we do at Sage. Big data presents interesting opportunities to shed new light on matters as diverse as consumer behaviour, modern-day communication and the prevention of crime. It also presents complex challenges to the social science researcher, not just in terms of technology, but also in terms of judgment and interpretation, not to mention ethical considerations around ownership and privacy. I'm very pleased to announce that Sage will be launching a new journal in 2014 entitled Big Data and Society to explore these very issues. At Sage, we're committed to championing the social sciences, not only through our publishing programme, but also by developing forums where social science debate can thrive beyond the conventional book or journal, such as our Social Science Space website and our Social Science Bites podcast series. We have in fact just recently released our latest podcast, an interview with Stephen Pinker in which he discusses why society has become less violent. He goes on to consider the nature of social science itself and indeed why, and I quote, the advent of big data has made social science sexy. At Sage, we're very proud to work in partnership with the British Academy, and this is the 4th event that we've sponsored in collaboration with them at the ESRC Festival of Social Science to shine the spotlight on the value of social science research and its influence on our social, economic and political lives. I would like to thank all of those at the British Academy and the ESRC for working so hard to put this event together, and I'd also like to thank the Times Higher, who are our media partner. We have a fantastically impressive panel of experts lined up to share their insights on the subject of big data. Without further ado, I will hand over to Polly Toynbee to introduce the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Polly Toynbee from The Guardian. I'm here really as a consumer of big data. Sometimes, as some of the people on the panel I think will be suggesting, it is a deluge of data, an indigestion of data, I think some have called it. But this is part of the Social Science Festival, and to which 20,000 people a year take part. I think not only personally am I a consumer of this kind of data, this kind of research, which we are, but so is The Guardian, as probably the paper that reports more social research than anybody else. But without further ado, I'm going to now introduce our very distinguished panel, where we have, the people who are most responsible for the collection and dissemination of big data. And we are starting with Paul Boyle, who is the Chief Executive of the ESRC, then Harvey Goldstein, who is Professor of Social Studies at the University of Bristol and a Chartered Statistician, Paul Wooby of the ONS, Chief Information Officer, and a very long list of other things too, or a very long title he has of ONS positions, and Dr. Farida Viss, who is Research Fellow of Social Sciences at the University of Sheffield, and who took part, some of you may have read it, in the Guardian newspaper's groundbreaking Reading the Riots project, which involved the study of 2.5 million tweets that happened during the riots. So I think we'll proceed straight away to Professor Boyle.
Sorry to interrupt you. Is it possible that we could have the photography restraint, which is becoming a nuisance and a distraction?
Do you want to take a few photographs at the very start of each event, perhaps, and then stop? Would that be all right?
Thank you very much, Polly, and thanks to everyone for inviting me along. I'll see if I can find my presentation, which is presumably on here somewhere. Here we are. So, thanks for the opportunity. As you say, this is one of the events that's going to be hosting the ESRC Festival of Social Science, something we're particularly proud of. As Polly says, I think last year there was something like 18,000 attendees to a couple of hundred events. I know there's at least 185 events this year. We'll wait and see how many actually attend. There's a Portraits of Britain exhibition being held, and the conclusion of that is on Wednesday night, where David Willits will hand out the prizes of a photographic competition, which is the sort of highlight event in London at least. What I'm here to do, though, is to talk about big data, something that before I came to ESRC was something I was quite heavily involved in. I'm going to use a broad definition of big data. So some people, when you think of big data, I think often associate it with the internet and Twitter and Facebook and so on. I'll include that, but I'll talk more broadly than just that. For those of you who don't know, just to give you one slide on the background for ESRC, we're the main funders of social science research in the UK. So we're funded by the government. We have a budget of around about £200 million a year that we invest in research projects, but also in funding PhD students, and of course funding major resources like some of the studies we're going to talk about here. In fact, there are a number of studies. We've already heard that the UK is world leading in the studies that it maintains. There's a number of studies where, at the moment at least, it's probably ESRC, which is the only funder of social science that can afford to maintain some of these very large studies. And as you'll hear, there's a number of those that we currently maintain. We're a non-departmental public body, and we have three key principles: quality, impact, and independence, and that means we only fund the very best and most excellent scientific research. We make sure that research, if at all possible, has impact. We take it for granted it will have academic impact, but we hope that it will also have social and economic impact beyond academic work. And the work that we fund is independent. So we're independent of government. Once the money is given to us, it's up to us and our academic peer reviewers to decide how we distribute those funds. This is a quick indication of how we do distribute those funds, gives you a rough idea of what our expenditure is like. And the bottom part here, £30 million or so that we spend on methods and infrastructure, is where most of the large data sets are funded from. So what do we mean by big data? What does ESRC support? We have a huge infrastructure, underpinned in particular by the UK Data Service. This UK Data Service provides access to a whole range of resources, in particular including census data and other surveys that we conduct, cross-sectional and other surveys. We have a secure data service. Both of these are based in Essex, although Manchester is heavily involved in the UKDS. The secure data service is a structure that helps us access sensitive data. So it's a mechanism for allowing us to get access to anonymised data in a robust and safe environment. The Administrative Data Liaison Service is a service which provides information about government-held administrative data, what sort of data are held by government departments about the public, and what access can academics get to them in a pseudo-anonymised or anonymised form. We've funded various other things, including e-science, and the British Election Study is something that we've funded for many years. So every time there's an election, we fund a major study to understand what's influencing people's views at the time of the election. What we're particularly known for, what we often call our jewels in the crown, though, are our longitudinal studies. And what we mean by longitudinal is we capture an individual person and we follow them through time, capturing information about them again and again. And that's crucial. It's only when you've got that type of study where you look at people's changing characteristics through time that you can grapple with causation, you can understand cause and effect. If you collect cross-sectional data, lots of information about a set of people at any one point in time, you can correlate things in those data, but you can't really start to grapple with what causes other things to happen. So that's why longitudinal data is so valuable. We supported the British Household Panel Study and now Understanding Society. Understanding Society is the world's biggest panel study, 40,000 households, 100,000 people interviewed every year. So we go back every year to capture how their lives are changing. The longitudinal study, the Scottish longitudinal study and the Northern Ireland version are all longitudinal studies based on the census. So there we have the 1991 census and the 2001 census. We link it together and then draw in some other sources of information. We funded the birth cohorts in 1958, 70 and the Millennium Study, and the most exciting of those, because it will be starting fairly soon, is the Life Study. The new birth cohort study, which will capture 110,000 children, capture them in pregnancy, and then follow them for the rest of their lives, looking at how their lives is changing along that way. A study which is involving both social science but medical science, brought together to try and understand a whole range of questions. We input some funding recently into the English longitudinal study of ageing as well. And the key thing that we say about these studies is that, like other research councils who fund really big pieces of kit like telescopes and ships and aeroplanes, for the social sciences, these longitudinal studies are our equivalent. There are major resources that we all draw upon. And unlike a ship or a telescope, our studies appreciate over time. They get better and better the longer we carry on with them, unlike some of the other investments which deteriorate, unfortunately. How do we make more out of this data? Well, we fund a whole range of different ways of doing that. We fund the National Centre for Research Methods, which brings together a whole range of training and methodological development to encourage the use of data and so on. We set up a secondary data analysis initiative. We've recently funded 58 projects under that initiative, which is specifically designed to encourage academics to grapple with the sorts of data we have available. That includes a whole range of projects that have been funded on things like financial affairs, ageing, families and so on. Our doctoral training centres, where we train the 600 students, we've allocated certain quotas in there to make sure that quantitative methods is a major part of the training that they provide. And as we've just heard recently, we've just launched, led by the Nuffield Foundation and HEFKey, a £15 million investment in undergraduate quantitative training to try and improve the quantitative skills of undergraduates as they come through to the postgraduate market. So that tells us a bit about what we already do, but there's obviously a whole set of things that we want to now engage in. There's all sorts of big types of data. I think the fourth talk you'll hear today will be very much about the internet and so on. Things like digital trace data. By that we mean the way that you interact with the internet, web pages you visit, IP addresses and so on. All sorts of opportunities there to capture information we've never held before or haven't held for a long time. Digitally enhanced publications, another area where we start to do more and more work about the publications that academics produce and how you can use the information in those publications and relate them to each other. And of course social media. But there's some challenges. The scale of what I've described here is the deluge of data. And also the theoretical grounding. While we are big funders of data, we've got to make sure we're funding data for good reason, not just for the sake of data. We've got to make sure that our academics come to us with really valid and strong reasons to encourage us to invest the sorts of money that's required to turn these into a resource that they can use. We need to think carefully about how we manage these data. Accessibility to the data is going to be an increasing problem. These data need to be accessible, interpreted and interoperable. We need to maintain trust. I've already talked about some of the types of information which need to be anonymised or pseudo-anonymised. And we've got to work out suitable governance arrangements for those types of data, which include ethical issues. So we need a joined-up UK-wide approach, in our view, to governance and ethics, and we also require the trust of the public. Events like today are the sorts of things that we might use. One of the problems is dealing with public attitude. So we know, for example, that response rates, and here I'm just using the Labour Force survey response rates, and you can see since 1993 up to June 2008, a significant reduction in the response rates that we're seeing in these surveys. We also know that attrition in some of our longitudinal studies are falling away. And that's encouraging us to turn to other forms of data where those sorts of problems may not exist. If we're going to do that, and I'm thinking particularly about if we're going to use routinely collected government data, for example, we've got to engage with the public as part of that process. That means raising awareness, explaining to the public why we want to do it and why it's a good idea. It means consulting with the public, so not just explaining what we do, but consulting with them about what we do. And it means empowerment, involving the public on our governing boards, involving the public in helping us to decide how we should handle the information that we're trying to put together. We also need to think about private sector data. There's a huge wealth of information in the private sector that at the moment academia is not making the most of. Google Data Analytics, we've just co-funded some projects with them, which is allowing us to get access to some of the publicly accessible data that they have to look at the value for social and economic research. We've employed what we call retail data navigators, and there we've just embarked on a few, 16 I think, master's dissertation projects using retail data, using the sorts of data that's collected by the retailers. So the first steps towards a strong engagement between academia and these private sector organisations. But our access to private sector data remains patchy. The potential for linking private sector and public sector data is fantastic. It would lead to all sorts of questions that we could answer that we can't answer yet, but we're a long way from achieving that. And we need convincing projects that will persuade the private sector and the public sector that doing that work would be valuable. We need to think about interdisciplinarity. So as social scientists, of course, we're desperately keen to collect information on social and economic issues. But there's a whole range of projects that require data collected from a range of different issues. So the life study that I mentioned before is a genuine interaction between medical and social or social science researchers. That's the way forward in our view to creating new resources that we can use. Closer is a new collaboration which is bringing together all the longitudinal studies and trying to engage with them all together. And we just held an epigenetics workshop. Epigenetics is all about the relationship between genetics and the environment, and the recognition recently that your genes can be changed by the environment you live in. They're not fixed entirely. You can change genes from the environment, and therefore we need to think about that in terms of all sorts of ways of analysing new information. But there's relatively few examples of interdisciplinary resource-based projects, and interdisciplinary training is lacking. Getting researchers who know how to handle medical, environmental, social science data, there are very few of those around. We need to think about international engagement. I'm just looking at my time. How long am I?
You're pretty much there.
Almost there, so I'll rush through the last few slides. ESRC funds a range of projects. We fund the European Social Survey. We funded Digging into Data, which is a range of projects for the Americans, Canadians and others. We've also embarked on the Council for European Social Science Data Archives, so working with the Europeans to try and bring all this information together, and a Pathfinders programme involved a range of countries looking at microdata. But there's relatively few integrated international projects, and global collaboration through data archives is lacking. We should be able to access census information in America and elsewhere as easily as they should be able to access it here, but at the moment that's not happening as freely as it should. And finally, I'm going to finish up with ministry data, one of the areas I've done a lot of work on. You'll hear, I'm sure, from ONS about the census, whether we'll have another one. At least according to Statistics Finland, and we could debate these figures, but they would claim that the cost of their census, and what they mean by census is using routinely collected administrative data instead of a big survey, they would say it's about 31 times cheaper to do that. Here's a very good example of where we could use administrative data. So this is comparing, it's an RCT trial, so a clinical trial, where people were given a placebo or a statin. And it's one of the first trials that was conducted, a very large trial in Scotland, to try and decide whether a statin reduced your chance of CHD-related death or a non-fatal MR. The clinical trial lasted for 5 years, and it was very clear at the end of the 5 years that there was a very significant effect. But the problem is when people leave the trial, they start taking on all sorts of different drugs. They may or may not maintain the drug in the way that they're meant to. You lose them and you're not sure what's happening. By using hospital data, you could follow those patients for another 10 years and in fact proved that the effect was long-term. The hospital part of this cost tens of thousands of pounds. The first 5 years cost millions and millions of pounds. So routine data has enabled us to understand a wonderful opportunity. I'm involved in something called the Administrative Data Task Force, which will be reporting actually in 2 or 3 weeks' time. And this is where we're trying to think of ways of using government-collected data in better and freer ways. There's a wealth of routine data out there. We need robust mechanisms for governance, which we believe we can put in place. And we need support from within government departments. But we do believe there's a need for legislation. We do require public engagement. And we think that UK-wide training and research accreditation is vital. So my final slide, on skills training capacity, we shouldn't just think about the data and what the problems are of dealing with data. We've got to think about how we train people to engage with it. The technical, analytical and management skills for using some of these resources are really quite challenging. And there are very few at the moment quantitative researchers around with those skills. We need deeper training in postgraduate and undergraduate courses. We need greater recognition of those technicians that work with us in academic departments but aren't part of the usual career progression. Those people with really great quantitative skills who don't somehow fit into academic career processes. We need more interdisciplinary training. We need more training on the ethics and governance of these sorts of data. And let's not forget that while we talk about a lot of this data as a new beginning, when we start looking at it carefully, many of these data sets have errors in them and have problems. And this is something we shouldn't forget because this could be a major challenge for the future. So if you'd like to learn more about ESRC, please visit the website.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to hear from Professor Goldstein.
Thank you very much, Paul. Paul has done a very nice outline of what big data are and what the possibilities are. And right at the very end, he talked about the errors, some of the possible drawbacks and difficulties. I think my role is to sort of take that up and talk about some of the problems, if you like to problematise some of the issues surrounding big data. So hence the numerical indigestion in the title. First of all, just to put this into some context, here's some examples of very, very big data sets. The biggest one I could find was the Higgs boson data. 10 to the power of 23, which is 100 zettabytes. A zettabyte is 10 to the power of 21. We aren't quite there yet with social science data. But we may be in 5 years' time. The interesting thing is that they're very happy analysing data sets of that size. It may take them several months, but the technology is there. And the whole of the big data debate has been very much driven by the availability of information technology and the internet, which makes this available. The most, I think, that social scientists have had to deal with probably is the census. Sometimes I think census with that's 30 terabytes, but in comparison with the Higgs boson data, or even with Twitter, 2010, and now it's more than that, this is still small fry. And as social science, as people use social data, then we're going to have to come to terms with data sets which in the future will be very much bigger than what we've been used to, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. The thing that really has, I think, made all the difference now is the availability of data through the internet. So it's not just researchers and people in the know who traditionally have been the ones who've had access to data and have analysed it. Now it's everybody, anybody in the media, any member of the public can now have instant access, and indeed it's government policy to promote that. And that's the big difference, and that brings a whole range of issues, ethical issues, issues of interpretation, and so on. So, just to elaborate a little bit, here are some of the things that Paul has already talked about, some of these. Looking at social networks, and Twitter is the one that people seem to be using more and more, but also things like Facebook, LinkedIn, all these social networks, and these are very complex data structures. And that's the other thing that I really want to mention, because underlying this, it's not just big data, it's data that are much more complex than many people have been used to thinking about and using. So if you think about something like Twitter or Facebook, the complexity of the structures there are enormous. Simply mapping those structures is a big feature, and people are busy developing algorithms. Paul referenced Google, but other people are doing it as well, and Frieda will talk about that later on as well. So it's not just the size, it's the complexity of these data sets which is very important. Paul's already mentioned the data mining, consumer spending patterns. Another one which I think is very interesting, certainly very interesting to, I'm sure, to all the academics in this audience, is the analysis of publications, to do things like do journal rankings and citation indexes. These data sets actually are enormous. I don't have any figures for how big, but they're way above the census. They're approaching, I think, Twitter time proportions. And there are a lot of people out there, including Google, who are probably doing it rather better than anybody else, trying to make sense of this, crawling the web, doing what's called web scraping, going around, trying to pick up data all over the place and then make sense of it. And one of the things I think we're going to hear from Liz later on is something about the algorithms that are being used. And finally, and Paul again referred to this, and we'll hear more about that, is the opening up of government databases, very much part of government policy. Okay, so I talked about the upsides and downsides, and here are some. So clearly the potential for better decision making is there. It has to be there if the data that are routinely collected, whether it's consumer spending patterns or whether it's health records, education records, once those become available on a large scale basis, and the more people who are involved in looking at and analysing them, at least in principle, that should facilitate more rational decision making as we develop the means to interrogate and analyse these data. The other important thing, and this one should be recognised by those that have done any kind of social research, these enormous databases allow us really for the first time to look at subtle interactions in the data. So take the example that Paul mentioned right at the end of a clinical trial. Typically clinical trials look at comparing treatment and control groups, and that's what Paul was reporting. But as we get bigger and bigger data sets, and we can link data sets to trials and administer data sets to trials, so we're going to be able to look at some of the more subtle interactions. What kinds of people does one treatment favour over another? Are there differences? Are there some cases where the difference we see between treatments and controls, or between different treatments, are actually reversed for different types of people? And these are really important questions. So in technical terms, we've been able, with relatively small data sets, to look at what are called the main effects, the average effects. With these really large data sets, the really exciting thing is to be able to look at these subtle interactions, look in much more detail. And certainly the longitudinal size, particularly the new one, the life study, with its vastly expanded sample size, is going to have some real opportunities to do that. And finally, another upside, has to be an upside, is that should the existence of these data sets and availability to people should allow people to become more informed, not only about what the data say, but in how to look at the data. And that's a particular challenge I'll come back to at the end. Okay, some upsides, and there are probably many more, but some downsides as well. The availability of these data sets, in particular, the availability of data sets to the media, that don't exactly have an unblemished record in terms of understanding and interpreting data. The possibilities of misleading these data sets is, I think, one that we need to recognise and take very seriously indeed. Whether that's unconscious, whether it's unintentional, or indeed whether it's deliberate and intentional, that's a very serious side effect. And we must look, we mustn't ignore that while we welcome the actual availability of all these data. And the other one, which I guess is sort of fairly obvious, is that the availability of data, linked data especially on individuals, actually does allow more control over individuals. So a whole lot of ethical issues that arise, and that's very important. And it's very interesting to compare cultures and countries. So if you've got the Nordic countries, for example, where in places like Denmark and Finland, enormous linked data sets, health, education, crime, and so on every citizen have been in existence for a long time and appear to be generally. How am I doing, Colin?
Yeah, you're doing well. You've got about 5 minutes.
Oh, that's fine. Appear to be accepted generally. The culture isn't one of great suspicion. At least that's the view from this side of the North Sea. Yet in this country, in the UK, I think there's a lot more suspicion, particularly about the way government might use these enormous data sets, especially when they're linked on citizens. And I think some comparative study of this issue would be very useful. And maybe there are people out there studying already that I don't know about. But I think it will shed some light on the future possibilities here. And it would be a great shame, I think, if these data sets, as they become available, weren't used, or there were severe restrictions placed on their use because of a distrust of the people that are providing. And that, of course, applies to commercial data sets as well as the official government ones. Okay, just about to wind up. We clearly need to embrace, and we can't ignore. By using the word we, I mean that all those professions that are concerned with data. So the statistics profession that, as it were, I come from, I think needs to embrace big data. Indeed, the Royal Statistical Society is very much doing that with its Get Stats campaign, and the British Academy too, by running events such as this, is doing a splendid job. The other thing that I think is very important is that the professions actually make it their task to try and bring into the debates around big data the understandings that as professions we share about data, about how to use data, how to collect data, how to understand and interpret and analyse data, which is, up to now, is fine because all those people who have been used to analysing data, as it were, have belonged to one profession or another, and at least in principle, there are sort of shared understanding. That doesn't exist, I think, in the general population. It doesn't exist in the media, it doesn't exist, I think, among policymakers generally. And I think it is one of the roles of the British Academy and the professions to try and disseminate those understandings. And I think it's a very important role. It relates to what Paul referred to as the training aspect of all this. And I think social scientists clearly need to reorientate their thinking. This is all happening very, very quickly. A little bit too quickly, maybe, for many of us. But it's out there and it's happening. And unless we kind of get in there and join it, it's going to pass us by and we may be left behind. So the big message here, I think, is how can we encourage informed debate, not just among ourselves, which the Academy has been doing, is very good doing, but in society generally, particularly, I think, in the media, and trying to get the media to talk sensibly and to think sensibly about all these issues. And that, I think, is where I finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we're going to hear from Paul Wooby of the ONS.
There you are. Security, that's good. Okay, so I'll try and tell you a little bit about what ONS is doing, what ONS sees as the big data debate.
This is a picture by issue, as you probably know. It's an illusion. I just like the picture, that's why I put it out. No, it's... if you go back, I traced my history back a long time. By 25 years ago, I was in nuclear physics, and I was working at Dunray, prototype fast reactor. And then we needed to download 4K of data. 4K. Okay, and we downloaded it onto a, well, we didn't download it, we entered it onto a memory stick that was about that size. And this was made up of hand-wound cores. There were 4,000 hand-wound coils to hold this data. But that was enough to do the reactor core loading. 20 years ago, and the God particle that you referred to is very apt. I worked at CERN in Rutherford Labs, and we were doing experiments to find the intermediate vector bosons, which you'll all be familiar with. The W and Z particles, as the Americans call them. W and Z to us. And that's, it was about 10 megabytes every 50 milliseconds of data we had to deal with. Something like that. You know, nowadays that's nothing, is it? But 10 years ago, in the pharmaceutical industry, we stopped scientists going into the lab. You know these things you get in movies, where people are experimenting with test tubes, and you see the scientist with his hair sticking up and it's exploding in his face, and all that sort of stuff. 10 years ago, we decided that we would do this in computer terms. It's just everything in medicine is now developed in a computer, not in vivo or in vitro, but in a computer. So we've done away with a lot of people's fun, actually. But so the essence was that the medicines, rather than being experimental or derived, were done in computers. So that's why it says big data is an illusion, or is it real? So I think if you take this second definition here, big data refers to high volume, high velocity, and high variety information assets. So, high volume, I think we've had that in the past. We've had high variety in the past. We've had high velocity, that's the speed at which you get this data. 10 megabytes every 50 milliseconds or something like that. How much is it now? Probably terabytes in a second, something like that. This is commonplace, but it was never in the public domain. That is the difference to me. Is the difference that we've had all this stuff in the past in private industry and private academic research, in industry in general, but never in the public domain. So it's now the public domain and this avalanche of data that makes this a very exciting period. So, big data poses issues. Issues of storage, issues of privacy, issues of security. But then that's kind of the thing we do anyway. You know, just as we go through life, we've gone from 4K to 4 terabytes, and now a terabyte is what, 25 quid? So, you know, you accept this natural trend towards bigger storage and bigger data. I saw an EMC were advertising in Terminal 5 and a great big billboard, big data, which presumably means big profits. So yeah, the storage of this data is a problem, but not one that's insurmountable. The data is more concerning if it's short-lived, uncontrolled, or unclear origin. And that is what the concern is for ONS. How can we demonstrate that this data is valid, that is controlled, that is the people that create this data are recognized authorities for creating it? Because this data is presented to us all over the internet. And what we've got to do is decide relatively quickly whether it's good or not. And we don't have the levels of competence to deal with this data, to deal with the analytics. So we need to move from administrators to information workers. So, couple of examples. The Billion Prices Project, which now can give an idea of the inflation in every country in the world, is done by scraping off the internet the prices. So that's a vast amount of data, pretty reliable sources of information that is starting to give us some indication of whether our RPI and our CPI are correct. So we can use the data to validate the data that we already have. More interestingly, intelligent traffic lights. This is quite good. Traffic lights apparently now can tell whether, not in this country, I guess that, can tell whether a car's windscreen wipers are good or not. That's useful, isn't it? Well, it is if you want to delay the length of time between red and green. Because if the rain is raining, you're more likely to skid and so on. So you take longer between. However, that also leads to information about the microclimate where the traffic lights are. And that is the key to big data. It's taking the data not at its face value, but for what it can infer, what you can extract, some meaning from this data that isn't obvious from the data itself. It's hidden. Okay? So the Australian National Institute of Statistics, the ABS or something, can now legally has access to all the till data. All the till data. So this is Tesco's and Asda and stuff like that. So they can get very accurate inflation indexes, but to get it, they have to deal with and analyze all that data. So how are they going to store it? How are they going to use it? How are they going to ask the questions they want to ask of this massive amounts of data? And so that requires really different analytic techniques, very different from what we're used to. And a nice one I like, I was speaking to a Russian chap, and he was saying that the Russian crop data was 10%, historical, 10% less than the American crop data of Russia. Now, how is that? How can the Americans tell what the Russians had as crop? So they got it from the satellite. Okay, so the Americans got it from the satellite, and this showed them all the crop data that they had, all the stuff they had. And the Russians got it by harvesting it. The important thing isn't the difference between the Russian and the Americans. The important thing is taking that data and saying, why? Why is it 10% difference? And the difference is the yield, when we harvest the crops, we lose 10%. We lose 10% of what we could have got. So that's good information we can use to give people more food. Okay. So I don't know how many of you remember De Bono. He was a kind of lateral thinker of his day. He was quite a film star, actually. I remember him well, being a young guy. So I think this is what big data relies upon. It relies upon some different thinking. Yeah, the kind of thing that De Bono would love. You put the square edges of things and a jigsaw in the middle, and the sticky out bits towards the outside. And they confuse everyone, that's the kind of people we need, I think, to deal with this big data. It's not big data per se, but what it leads to, what it can infer, what we can get out of it. So, I think that big data has not simply emerged. There's a continuum of data. And big data, any time in a continuum, is just as much as we think is big. So big data 25 years ago was 4K. Big data now is however big it is. But in 10 years, they'll look back at me and say, yeah, he was an idiot. How could he say that was big data? It's not. It's a drop in the ocean. So I think this continuum is something we're going to have to deal with. So for ONS, we still do surveys on paper. We send it out to people, and we get them to fill in a form. And people like that. So during the census, recent census that's just finished, in sending out these forms to people, 82% of people preferred to fill it in on paper, not via electronic form. Although we're given access to electronics, to the internet, to fill the form in. And why is that? We don't really know. We think that perhaps people like to sit around the fire and get the data from their family, you know, ask their son what their name is, that sort of thing. They haven't talked for generations. I don't. But ONS typically gets data via written. Am I doing okay for time? No?
A few minutes.
Okay, that's a pity. We are progressively moving towards administrative data. So the data the government already holds in tax, in health, in education, in benefits, we can bring all that data together, anonymize it, because we don't want people, we want statistics. But we can bring that data together and get the equivalent, or kind of near the equivalent of the census, via this administrative data. But that is only the middle section, I think, of what was going to come, where the huge amounts of data we're presented with can help to corroborate the surveys that we do. They can help to corroborate the evidence that we have. And so, if I just go on to talk about this thing. Google Trends. We've been looking at Google Trends recently. So if you look at Google Trends is where you're searching, where the searches that people do are captured by Google and are watched over time. So if you look at benefits, what people search for benefits, that follows a nice path. If you say the same data, putting that data to one side, you say, what is the unemployment rate in this country? So ONS gets that. You get a nice curve. It is mirrored almost exactly by the Google Trends data, the search for benefits. So the unemployment curve and the benefits curve look like each other. It looks like there's a good correlation between the two. And that helps us to give us more information to underpin the surveys. So we see that with time, the number of surveys that we do, the number of forms we issue goes down, and we increasingly rely upon the use of the administrative data to get the same information. Okay, last slide. So I think that, can we control, do we see ourselves as in control of all this big data? No, that's ridiculous. We can't possibly control the data. We don't want to be a big brother, we certainly don't want to be there. But we can ensure that the data of the right quality is turned into information if we have people with the lateral thinking and the intelligence, bright people that can join together the IT and the statistics to make something of this data. That's what we need.
Okay, I've got 9 slides, so I'll try and go through it quickly. So I want to say something about my own adventures in big data. I'm not a statistician, and I'm not particularly good at quantitative methods. So there is an adventure tale here. My PhD looked at the Palestine-Israel conflict, and I did really proper old-school newspaper archive, collecting of articles. I spent nearly a decade doing this, but this is a very, very small data set that I turned upside down and inside out, and I was looking at both text and images across 3 case studies, and I was doing a content analysis, a frame analysis, and a discourse analysis. Then Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005, and I became interested in the ways in which, because my PhD has looked at perpetrators and victims, the ways in which people kind of online really rejected the ways in which, particularly the African American victims of this storm, were now seen as perpetrators somehow. And it was a kind of classic case of blaming victims, which I've also seen in my PhD. And I was very interested in how black people are apparently looters and white people find things. And
traded in the blogosphere. And so I looked at Flickr data and discussions, so there's kind of feral data out there where people are discussing this media framing, so I became really interested in that. Then further controversies, I'm from the Netherlands, it's kind of never far from controversy. Geert Wilders, a right-wing politician, put this video on the internet basically saying Islam is a huge threat to not just the Netherlands but Europe and the world. Of course. And what we looked at here was the ways in which people responded to this video on YouTube, the ways in which people were uploading videos themselves to become part of this discussion. And these were particularly people who traditionally aren't part of these mainstream media debates, in this case particularly Muslims. And then last year, I got involved in this project that Polly already mentioned, Reading Rights. And looking at Twitter data, so I'm the lady talking about the internet and kind of filthy Twitter data. So I went from kind of little data to unstructured big data in a not very long period of time. And I can tell the story differently. Hurricane Katrina 2005, I looked at 235 posts uploaded by 106 individuals, and manual collection was still possible. Then I moved on to the Fitna project. I looked at over 1,400 videos uploaded by 700 individuals, and all of a sudden computer scientists became really important in being able to do that project. And so from about 2007 onwards, I've been sort of making computer scientists my best friends. I can recommend it. And then Reading Rights required a lot of computer science, because all of a sudden we were looking at 2.6 million tweets uploaded by 700,000 individuals. So this is a little bit of a story from, fairly small data sets to, again, now, year on, 2.6 million tweets, I don't get terribly excited about it anymore, but it just became a lot bigger. And a lot of people were involved in this project. So I'm sort of trying to list all of them. This is a project led by Professor Rob Corkshaw at Manchester, and I led the analysis of these tweets. But as you can see, there are lots and lots of people involved. So what these kinds of projects require is really working across disciplines and also across industries in this case, because it was a close collaboration with Guardian. Just another quick reference point in terms of my own work on big data. I'm particularly interested in text journalism. So I'm a co-author of the Data Journalism Handbook, where big data is also a big story. You can, if you're interested, you can download this for free from datajournalismhandbook.org. Now, one of the things that is really important, I think, to say something about is the shrinking of timeframes in terms of delivering these kinds of projects. So, as an academic, delivering Reading Rights on Twitter work in 8 weeks was really a very tight turnaround and sort of nearly killed us. But then this weekend I decided to stab at fake Sandy pictures with 2 Australian colleagues. And so in terms of collaboration, in terms of kind of moving on to these data sets very quickly, we did this in a weekend. And we looked at 250,000 tweets uploaded over a period of 4 hours, 2 hours before the storm hit and 2 hours after it. And when I say hit, I mean, of course, the East Coast of the United States, which seems to be the key area people are interested in. And we did this over a weekend, and what we were interested in is the circulation of fake images. So there were apparently a lot of sharks swimming around in New Jersey, and people thought the flooding of Ground Zero was fake, and so we were very interested in kind of the ways in which news values were shaped by the Twitter sphere, because all of us were encouraged to only think about the East Coast of the United States, which I think is a huge problem. Okay, so there is a real on-the-ground application for this kind of thing, particularly in terms of the crisis management community. And I see a lot of potential for cross-fertilization, data journalism, analytical insight, but also access to data. Access to data is a really huge issue. Access to social media data is a really huge issue, and also access to these tools. So a lot of them are locked away in industry, the Googles and so on. And we don't really have access to them or to their workings. So lots of big data on the internet, this has been mentioned a few times already. And one of the things I think hasn't really been addressed so far is the tension with small data and the tension between the macro and the micro. And so one of the things that I was struck by is Dick Costolo, the CEO of Twitter, using Ai Weiwei's installation in the turbine hall at the Tate to explain that when you see this kind of sunflower seed from a distance, you don't really know what you're looking at. It's just this like big sea of kind of little black stones. But then when you come closer, you see that they're individually shaped sculptures. And so what Costolo says is what we want to bring, that's what they want to bring to Twitter, the ability to shrink the world and allow everybody to see each other. Of course, you can question these claims, but what he does introduce here is this tension between, the bigger picture and then this micro. And there's Ai himself offering some sunflower seeds. So we can think about Twitter as these kind of carefully sculpted sunflower seeds, which of course neatly leads to Turing's centenary and algorithms. So the role of algorithms and big data is, I think, really important. And what I think is missing so far is a discussion about little data and value that you can extract from these data sets only if you know what you're looking for. And that value will come from little data. So context, I tell my students this ad nauseum. The other thing that I think is important when we talk about social media is the space. What kind of space is Twitter? So Ai Weiwei is in an art gallery. This is not a public space. And these seeds, sold recently at auction at $3.50 a pop, have monetary value in the same way that Twitter data now has monetary value. And there's now 3 companies that are licensed to sell this Twitter data. So we're talking about buying this big data, which I think has serious consequences. Big money in red, that's significant. Small data, meaning. I'm really interested in meaning. I'm interested in what things mean. And therefore the context, understanding data in context is so important. And this is where I would really believe qualitative methods to be added to this big data story as being able to interpret these smaller data sets. Do I have time, Polly, to talk about influence?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. How many minutes do I have left?
About 5.
Okay. Influence is another thing that was mentioned already in terms of citation that Harvey mentioned. So I want to take on a very quick journey of cloud. Now, I don't know if anyone knows the company Cloud, but it's saying that for the first time we're all on an even playing field, apparently. And this is about what we are worth on social media. So this is big data is not enough. We need giant data. So big data is already kind of old news. So we need giant data. And what Cloud does is it basically scours the internet for different signals to come up with a score for all of us online. So here they're sort of bragging about 12 billion signals a day into a Hive data warehouse of more than 1 trillion rows. I don't know what any of that means, but it's sort of giant data. Of course, ethics has been mentioned already. I'm glad I don't have to do it again. So what it produces is a cloud score. So my score is 52. You don't know what that means, but apparently a score higher than 40 suggests a strong but niche following. Influence is about engagement and motivation, not just racking up legions of followers. So it's also about metrics. So just having lots of followers isn't valuable anymore. You need to engage with them. So then Cloud, has an algorithm running in the background that tells you, you'll be pleased to hear that my topics of influence include sleep deprivation, Facebook and community. So this is an algorithm telling you who I am, and if you would like me to come and give a presentation about sleep deprivation, come and ask for my card afterwards. But there are implications of reducing people to a number. There are implications of reducing people to a citation index and reducing kind of people's influence online to this number that is produced in a rather murky way. So my friend John, who's not on Cloud, but he still has a score because he's on Twitter. Now technically this is illegal in the UK, but they're still doing it. Now Aaron Zinman of the MIT social media group produced this other fun installation personas where you can kind of Google yourself and then this algorithm will produce a data visualization for you. So with a name like FreeDeviz, you have very good kind of SEO. I guess nobody else called that. And so basically what this thing does is, and I've taken some screenshots where it sort of characterizes me. You'll be pleased to see that yellow is sports. So this is natural language processing, saying that things like team and having been in collaboration means that I have a big band of sport in my characterization, and then education starts to come up. So there's a number of things that I recognise here that my jobs, where I've worked, and so on. And so this thing is building. And so what you end up with is something that says that I have a profile that includes online sports, education, but also illegal and legal. What that means, I have no idea. The point is that there's politics of the algorithm at work here. And so it's funny, but it's not funny at all. And we have to, I think, start talking about a human algorithm. Where do humans come in terms of interpreting this data and making interventions into this data? The role of data visualization, again, not mentioned yet. Thinking about data as a portrait, as having an author, as being created by somebody, by a patron, we might even think about. The whole versus a fraction. What can the data really tell us? Can it tell us something about the whole? Often it can only really tell us something about a fraction, but we seem to be obsessed with wanting the whole picture. And of course, data visualizations, as much as they show, they hide. They're very good at hiding things. You can think about them as an interface, and I think these are things we need to really think about much more critically. So, if I go back to my PhD and my frame analysis, I think what we are witnessing is a symbolic framing contest around the story of big data, around what big data means for academia, what it means beyond academia. So my question then becomes, who gets to do big data? Because these are these have serious implications in terms of funding, in terms of what kind of academics we produce, and what kind of academics we value. So I think I want to also know is what do we invest as a community in this big narrative? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the only thing that makes me feel it's not altogether scary is when Amazon asks me if I'd like to buy some eyelash curlers, or Twitter asks me if I'd like to follow somebody I'd rather die than follow. So it seems to me not entirely accurate as yet. Now we have a bit of time for the panel to make points about one another's presentation, ask each other questions, raise issues that you've heard from one another. And I don't know who would like to start. Harvey, would you want to take up anything?
Yeah, okay. It's really to Paul here. You talked a lot about ONS utilising administrative data, linking data files and so on. But, you know, the evidence is that linking is not perfect, that you can make mistakes, there are errors. And in fact, there's quite a literature on some of the big errors you can make if you don't get your linking right. Some records are easier to link than others. And there's also the issue of data quality. The data originate from somewhere, and they may originate from people checking boxes or keying things into computers. How do you propose, how does ONS propose to deal with those kinds of issues? How much is that going to hold you back from the sorts of developments you were talking about?
Yes, it's very true. You know, there's a tension, isn't there, between speed and accuracy. So I think that ONS is perhaps a little bit slow to generate results, but those results are valid, they're accurate, they're true. So there's a society, we place a lot of value on what ONS says. And so if we move to this use of administrative data, we're moving it perhaps down the quality sphere if we're not careful. And so that is why we see administrative data as purely underpinning the results that we get from surveys. So we need to go to a smaller sample size, use the administrative data to back that up, and we get a bigger set, and there's more actual data that we can handle. So it's not a question of moving entirely to administrative data, which may be invalid or maybe have errors in it, or linked databases that have to be accurate and aren't. It's that plus the survey data, which gives us a great deal of confidence that we've got it right.
Do you want to raise anything?
One point that Harvey raised, and I don't think we dwelt upon at all really, but I think is interesting, is that we would expect there to be cultural differences and perhaps age group differences in the attitudes to the use of information. So we know that young cohorts are coming through have a very different attitude to their use of their own personal information to perhaps older cohorts. We know, for example, in Sweden and parts of Scandinavia, once a year in the local newspaper, so your local town newspaper, they'll publish the name and the list of the highest earning people with the precise income that these people earn, just to let the public know the high earners. Now that's something in Scandinavia they seem perfectly happy about, but in the UK we wouldn't be particularly happy about. So there are very clear cultural differences, and of course there will be cultural differences within the UK about what we should or shouldn't do with data. So some of the issues around there I think would be interesting to explore.
One of the questions I wanted to raise that question too when you talked about the difference between the Nordics now, that there is a strong correlation between societies that trust each other a lot, and this is an element of that, and societies who don't, and societies that are very equal and very unequal. I think the spirit level research brought that out rather strongly. Do you think the reason we are so suspicious and so anxious about Big Brother and all of that in a way that the Scandinavians really aren't is connected with a general societal trust on every level, and perhaps to do with living more equally and hating each other less?
I say beware inferring causation from correlation to begin with. Yes.
I'm a journalist.
But I do think there is something in what you say. I'd be interested to hear whether there's been any real good social science research and comparative research on this, whether in fact, I suspect what you say is right, but I don't know there's good evidence that actually supports that link causally. So whether we change to become a less unequal society and therefore moves in that direction or not, I don't know. I suspect there are other historical reasons why we are like we are in the UK, and those are different historical reasons from what's happened in the Nordic countries. But it's not just due to the equality.
Paul, is the ONS finding people much more mistrusting and much more suspicious? I mean, there seemed to be more noise about the census this time than there was the time before, and a sense that the state was up to something, and a general lack of trust in what you were doing and why you were doing it.
I think that the response rate for this last census has been very high, actually. So that isn't borne out by the evidence. However, the response rates in general for surveys are going down. So that may indicate a lack of trust or just an increasing boredom amongst the population, that they just can't be bothered to fill in these surveys now that are not mandatory. So the census was mandatory and people by and large filled it in. But other surveys aren't, and people are not as willing as they used to be to fill them in. And that's probably one of the reasons why we have to corroborate what we get from surveys with use of admin data.
Farida, do you want to raise anything or ask anybody or challenge anyone?
No, not needed. Not yet.
Anything else you wish to raise before I throw it open to the public? Right. It's your turn now. We have a microphone. We have one or two? We have one. So let's take... Yes? I'll take you. Can you say who you are and where you're from?
William Collin, Professor of Public Health from the Royal Society of Public Health, and a member of the RSS Statistics Users Forum. The crunch that is coming in local government, which I think nobody mentioned, are the new health and well-being boards. Well-being was mentioned. We're supposed to know about well-being in relation to health, so data linkage at a very local level, at least neighbourhood by neighbourhood, probably street by street, even household by household. This system is supposed to be in shadow form on March 31st, and the final decisions that will be based on it will be made about October 1st next year. And they simply don't have the data skills And we're headed for very costly local government errors because of the lack of preparedness of the health and well-being boards. I say to my own shame because I'm involved in London County Council, and it's one of the more advanced ones because we have a pilot for community budget. So we ought to be ahead of the other local authorities. But it's a real problem.
Can you explain exactly what sort of information is needed and who's supposed to collect it?
It's linking things like unemployment, housing, antisocial behaviour with specific dimensions of health. And if I could give an example from my old patch, I'm no longer in Barking and Dagenham, but I know, Polly, you've written in the past about the rise of BNP and COVID-18 in Barking and Dagenham. And about the time that Frida was doing her middling research, just starting to use computers, I was searching for any community evidence for the degrees of race hatred that we were picking up in Barking and Dagenham, which had never been seen in that area since the war. And I searched everywhere and I found a neighbourhood that just looked just like the estate where COVID-18 had its headquarters. It was extraordinary. The same language is being used in different communications, same sort of problems, same interactive tension. And I contacted this group and said, look, is this really happening? Is it just like what's happening here? We didn't have the riot I expected, but in Manu, where I identified something very similar, they did, which raises interesting ethical questions, because I was doing it because I thought we were really going to get a riot. Instead, what happened in Dagenham on the unemployment side was Ford laid off 10,000 workers at their traditional assembly line there. And the key lesson from that was the dynamic relationship. The ill health took off well in advance of people actually losing their jobs. It was anticipatory in terms of domestic violence, drug use, self-harm. So they're very complex, local, dynamic relationships. And if we're going to do public health at the local level the government wants, that's the sort of data we need.
Right. Is that your bag?
I don't know. I don't know. I think that's true. I think that's. I agree with you. Actually, if you can get, I think it's the inference, isn't it? When you see this data presented at a local level, and then you realise it's something like the Ford laying off people, it's pretty obvious what the linkage is. And I guess it's how you derive that, what people are qualified to get at that microdata. That's good point.
Frida.
In my spare time, I do a lot of stuff around open data and allotments. And so one of the things that I did last year is I released all allotment data in the UK through The Guardian, Polly will be pleased to hear. But one of the things which I think is a really important data set, people interested in growing their own vegetables, caring about their well-being, caring about their neighbourhood, and so on, wasn't available through the local councils, and I had to use the Freedom of Information Act to release it across the UK. So I think one of the things, even before you get to the skills, is how do you get the data? And so sometimes you assume that certain data sets through open data initiatives will be available, and I had every hope that allotment data would be available. I mean, we're in the UK, people care about allotments, and it wasn't, and I had to do a lot of legwork to get it released. So sometimes the data simply isn't available.
Yep.
Yep. Thanks, Matthew Fuller from Centre for Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths. I'm interested in a lot of the kind of things that have been brought up here about society being observable through these mechanisms, through data and so on. But I'm also interested in how we can look at the way in which these systems are active in society. Frida mentioned, we had to have a critique of the algorithm. We've also had the idea that data structures also have to be learned. I wonder how you recommend what you recommend for a study of the way in which data, software systems, database systems, etc., are also active. And one of the ways we've seen blame for the riots on BlackBerry Messenger, BBM, but we can also see the government's open data initiative as preparing local council services for privatisation. So there's a lot of this stuff is about shaping up and acting in society. So I'm kind of interested in how you see that itself being studied. Facebook, Google, open data, etc. How do we study those?
Is that another one for you, Farida?
It's a study of capitalism. And a critique.
Yes, do.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I mean, the algorithms that are used by people like Google and others, some of them we don't know about. They're secret, and obviously for commercial reasons, they're secret. But they generate a lot of data which people want to use. But without a knowledge of how the data are generated, I think the whole thing does become problematic. And it's not just who generates the data, for what reasons. It's the actual way they're generated. And as social scientists, one will always want to know how the data are generated, because that has to influence the way in which you interpret them. So one of the challenges, I think, and I think it's an interesting technical challenge really, is to actually discover what those algorithms actually are. And I can actually think of, as it were, some experiments that you could in principle carry out using particular designs with inputs of different data from different types of people to make some inference about how the algorithms are actually working. If they won't tell you what the secrets are, there are ways, and some of us are quite skilled at doing this, of finding out what actually the algorithms are doing. So I think there's actually quite an interesting, or rather important area of research, looking at Paul here, to be done on how those data are being generated.
Who else? We've got a microphone. Where are we? Woman here, 2 rows back.
Hi, my name is Mandy Dami. I'm a regional psychologist at the University of Surrey. I spent a lot of my career working in North America, and I'm very encouraged to find that now we've got more social scientists becoming quantitatively trained in this country than before, because I think we're lagging as social scientists compared to our colleagues in other countries. And big data will be a useful sort of shift in that direction. What's missing for me in the big data debate is, as a scientist, is the role of theory. So I would like to put to Paul, perhaps, whatever happened to theory?
Right.
Actually, I was very careful to make sure theory was on my slides, but I maybe didn't talk about it for long enough. No, I think you're absolutely right. To go to your first point, we have invested quite heavily now in quantitative methods training at the undergraduate level. It's a bit of a departure, in a way, for ESRC, because we tend to fund postgraduate and above. And our reasoning for funding at that level is that we're interested in coming in, and we'll see how universities react to this call, but encouraging them to think about 4-year social science degrees that include a final year, which is a master's level, which is really advanced. I absolutely agree with you that there is a shortage of quantitative researchers, and we need somehow to fill that gap. So we need some sort of step change in the number of people coming through with really advanced techniques. Let me give you a very simple example. John McInnes, who I think is in the audience somewhere, has written a lot about all of this. And he points to the problem that in many university courses, you will be judged on your courses pretty much entirely by writing essays. So using English, the written word, to explain your understanding of concepts. And you might have one course, one module in the whole degree, which involves, in a social science degree at least, involves you actually using some form of quantitative maths to try and explain your understanding of concepts. And I think that difference is huge. And we need quantitative methods in some degrees, not all, and it's not in any way to undermine the more qualitative side of the disciplines, which is vital, but in certain degree programs we need to embed that. On the theory, I agree with you entirely, and I think I did throw up something about not data for data's sake, and I didn't elaborate very much. But I absolutely agree. We can run into the trap as a funding agency that the next bit of data we should link is almost obvious. You know, why can't we put biomedical information on the next panel study? And we do that on occasion, but it's tempting to do it just for the sake of it, that we can do it. And I think we've got to make sure that we have the scientists out there persuading us why the biomedical information added to one cohort study, why it's vital to then add it to another, or why it's vital to add it to a panel study. If we've got the real science, the real theory underneath those, the reasoning for doing that, then I can be persuaded that we should try and seek the funds and think about doing it. And I think there's been a little bit of a temptation to do it because it seems like a rather obvious thing to do. Now, having said that, we are very much behind setting up general purpose studies. We do set up things like Understanding Society, which have a myriad of information in them, not just to test a single 1 or 2 hypotheses. We understand that these will become general purpose. Lots of people use it for lots of things we'd never imagined in the past. So it's got to be a balance between the two. If we can link some of these data sets together, we really do come up with studies that are wonderfully exciting for certain researchers, but we just do need a bit more, as you've said, of the theory to underpin some of the justification for that.
Yes, do.
So at ONS, the reason that we're having difficulty reading out the list of things I was responsible for was...
It was rather long.
It was rather long, yeah. Apart from those big. Was that we have joined together ONS, methodologists and IT people. So the methodologists, well, you all know IT people. They're the people in anoraks and wellies. And the methodologists are the people in kimonos and sandals. Okay? And these two groups of people will not talk to one another. But we see this blend of people as being the absolute pinnacle of what we need. We need IT people, the experience in linking databases together, getting the warehouses going, with the social scientists, with the statisticians and methodologists that can actually think about what we're doing. And it's important to put those both together. And that's why we've got that long list of titles.
In case you missed them, he's Chief Information Officer, Director of the Strategy and Standards Directorate, Head of the IT Profession, and Senior Information Risk Owner of the INS.
Stanford,
of the ONS.
Really?
It's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Yeah, thanks.
I haven't worked out what the acronym would be. Who else? Who next? Yes, the woman shaking her hand vigorously.
You get noticed.
My name is Margaret Scotton, I'm a social worker. My point will probably be quite short, and that is, how are we going to arrange when you search for data that it's easier to get different countries' views? I find a lot of time when I'm searching, I get several American studies and have to look down for the English studies. Maybe it's not that I've got the best of searching skills. You can look from the age of me. I'm not perhaps best trained. But I do get the feeling that it would be a very good idea to start planning search engines so you could put in different country approaches. So maybe you get 6 different countries' approaches. And I'll end just on that point. I say I can never understand why I can find a wealth of American literature, but nothing from Canada. And I think it's time that Sage and other people start looking at this, because otherwise there's a wealth of very good English and Nordic research that is just not being noticed. And one of the reasons for the Nordic people perhaps being more ready to look at research, methods and surveys and things, could be that it's being disseminated more fairly and people don't think it's veering in one direction or another. That's the end.
Okay. I'll just take a few at a time. Take the gentleman in the middle here. You've got one over there, have you? I'll take that lady next door to you.
On the international side, there must be masses of fascinating questions to be answered by transnational comparisons. That's had very little prominence this evening in the discussion. I wondered if United Nations, for example, is making huge progress in coordinating an approach to this sort of issue.
Same sort of issue, yes. And take you too.
I'm Carol Destra from the University College London. I wanted to ask Harvey particularly about your questions about inference. And you really, in your talk, suggested that misinterpretation of the data is either deliberate or an unconscious thing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the science of inference. I think we've got a lot of good experience in the clinical trials arena about the problems of suppression of negative findings, so that's a Ben Goldacre kind of line. We also know that the completeness of data is quite important in terms of follow-through, but also there's been quite a lot of methodological research comparing findings from observational studies with randomised experiments. And I think those have shown where bias can occur and how one can take steps to mitigate bias, which is not just through missing data in making inferences from observational data. And I think that's particularly important when we want to move to situations where randomised experiments are not possible. I think Paul's example of the Wascots trial is lovely. but actually we're looking often at natural experiments, particularly in social policy. And the comparison, for example, that was done on the Scotland introducing the smoke-free legislation earlier than the UK was a wonderful example of being able to make some inferences there about quite important social policy. But how do you maximise those opportunities within data so we can actually improve reliability of inference? I think would be really important.
Paul, can I ask you to answer the question first about the international comparisons and whether we use them enough?
Yes, there is work being done, of course, and there are studies which are international in design. So the European Social Survey is a good example of that, where we collect information across a range of countries purposefully in the same way to try and do comparisons. But there's no question that we don't do enough of that, in my view. Talking about natural laboratories, Europe offers a wonderful natural laboratory where we have different welfare systems, we have all sorts of different policies implemented at different times, and we could compare the effectiveness of those. We can even think about doing that between England and Scotland, because Scotland, of course, has different policies to do with alcohol pricing, to do with free care for the elderly, to do with free prescriptions, all sorts of things that are slightly different. And the English-Scotland comparison is a nice one because society is very similar in many ways, but different in some of these tunes. So I think the idea of transnational studies is an exciting one. And there are two other parts to that question. I mean, one, I think we should, as researchers, be able to access data more freely across countries. So, for example, working with American colleagues who have collaborated with me to use British census data is okay, but they find it a little bit challenging to access these data themselves. That, I think, should be solved, because I think we can put in place mechanisms to make sure the data can be managed properly. And I think also we've got to think about, cutting our cloth better. If there are big studies being established in different countries, it would be fantastic if they were established in more similar ways. Now, it's challenging, because it means getting big funding agencies to agree at the same time to set up large-scale studies. But imagine if we start a panel study of 100,000 people here, and in Germany and America they start the same panel study, and we end up with a resource which really allows us to compare across those countries. Now, that's a challenge to get all the funding agencies lined up and get all the countries to agree that the same set of questions are of similar interest. It's all sorts of challenges. And I think there's quite a bit of work to try and at least bring together the existing studies where we can. And it does happen to a degree, but it's never as joined up as perhaps you might imagine.
I think I'm going to ask the last question, I'm afraid. We have to stop shortly, but I'm going to put it to each of you. Harvey, you raised an interesting question in the course of the pluses and minuses, and was one you said as a plus that does it mean we have more informed citizens, an enhanced democracy? What evidence we have for that? It often worries me that we have so much information singing at us all over the place, so many more people able to access any amount of information at the click of a mouse. They can find out anything they want to know. And yet there's no sign, as far as I can see, that we have, in general, a better informed or more engaged set of citizens, certainly when it comes to political questions. People don't seem to know any more than they do. Maybe you're right to blame the press, setting about deliberately misinforming people, which no doubt it does, never The Guardian, but much of it does. How are we to think about this? Information overload, and is it really educational in a deep way?
Well, I think I said in principle. I didn't say it would happen. And in the case of The Guardian, I'm sure it happens unconsciously rather than deliberately. I think this is an extremely important question, and it's I think one of the really big challenges that we have to face. And I think the media of all kinds does have a particular responsibility to do this, and it's actually quite difficult to get the media to recognise it. I mean, some parts of the media do, but clearly the media, most of the media, has to come up with some kind of instant response to what's going on in the world, and the difficulty is to get the media to reflect more and to hold back, to question the obvious conclusions from looking at data. And I don't really know how you do that. I think it's a long, very difficult process. I don't think there are any magical answers to this. But I have to say, I mean, I think The Guardian's been very good. I mean, having people like Ben Goldacre and so on is a great advance. And I think the BBC, with its More or Less programme that's been going for several years, is an enormous advance on what went before. So I think things are changing. I think there is more awareness out there, but it's a very, very slow progress. And I suspect we may not have the time, because big data is on us and is going to flood us. And I think the indigestion side of it may well be the one that comes to dominate. I'm very sad about that, but I think we just have to keep trying. I have no easy answer to that.
I'm always in the position of having to explain the media to people who say the media should, the media ought. And I think that's be responsible. And I think that's a category error. That it simply isn't the sea it swims in. Guardian tries to, BBC does pretty much. But if you're talking about the Mail or the Sun or the Telegraph, they are simply not in the world of what ought we to do. I'm afraid.
Yeah,
Do you want to say a word about the about this question about what good is it doing us in the wrong? Is it making us better citizens?
I think it's an interesting question, and I think there are upsides and downsides to this information deluge, as some have called it, and so on. I think there's no question, though, that younger people, as they come through, become very adept at using the information. If I look at the teenage daughters I have, they're extremely adept at using the internet and other social media in ways that I'm not. Whether they would use it for the same reasons that I would, of course, is a different matter altogether. And whether it actually makes them better informed about the things I'd like them to be more informed about is a different matter altogether. So I think for those that use it, they do get a lot out of it. I think I'd go on the next step to say that there's huge benefit that can come, despite all the difficulties with these sorts of data, despite all the things we've heard about, challenges of using them. We can do an awful lot of research as academics in the public benefit from all of this information. And quite often you hear the debate around having to have this dichotomy between should we allow researchers to get access to some of these data to undertake research in the public benefit, and the other side is we need to protect people's privacy. My view is that that's not a dichotomy. You can protect people's privacy while allowing academics to get access as long as you do it in a robust way. And at the end, I think the value that can come from that hugely outweighs the risks associated with it.
Thank you. Farida, any thoughts about that?
Yes, many. I guess the question for me isn't necessarily are we creating more informed citizens, is do we actually want to create a more equal society? Which makes it a question about politics and power. And we can have these grand narratives about, trying to create more informed citizens, but I think it's the mechanisms through which that may or may not happen, which brings us back to politics and whether or not this is actually about creating, greater equality. And I think that leads us then maybe as academics to think, is that what we strive for? And I think these are, much larger questions than we can answer here, but I do think that, we must ask them.
Does more information do us good?
So the internet has given us the ability to create an awful lot of rubbish. And if that rubbish, take the presidential election, so the analysis revealed that we've got 10 times as much for this presidential election of data as we had in the past. Is it all right? No, almost certainly not. So are we better informed? I don't know. No, I don't think so. But what I do know is that as individuals, we tend to go to places we can trust. And that's the key. Who do you trust? So is it the BBC? Yeah. Is it ONS? Is it the government? Yeah. Who do you trust? And so in deciding that question, I think it's not the data that's out there, not the information that's out there, but whether you trust the person that's put it out there.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to thank the panel very much. Sorry it wasn't time for all of your questions, but thank you.